Jackson Hole and You. September 1, 2019 by Anna von Reitz. All I really need to tell you is that G7 was a meeting of governments and Jackson Hole was a meeting of bankers, and you should automatically turn your attention to what went on in Jackson Hole. We have the Brits in their usual role as agents of destruction. We have the Americans in their usual role as savior fall guys. At least the Brits have admitted the logical necessity of vastly expanding their already completely insupportable credit bubble in order to keep afloat. I am reminded of a famous British Naval History saga in which a British ship in a Dutch port laden with a load of manure labelled "Ship High in Transport" was in danger of both sinking and exploding at once. The danger of sinking was caused by numerous leaks in the planking of the hull and the inability of the bilge pumps to keep up. The danger of exploding was caused by the increase of methane gas that is released in greater quantities when the manure gets wet. So here we are at the bilge pumps, both parents working 3 jobs and at least 60 hours per week trying to keep the family in a house with a roof and food on the table, and there are the bankers adding to the problem they created and suggesting that more of what caused the problem is what is needed to solve it. Just let us exponentially increase our debt bubble and keep insuring ourselves with your assets, at your expense, and all will be well. We'll just float a cashless currency on nothing at all, think up some new big words to dazzle the bystanders, and continue to claim that $1 of hot air is equivalent to $1 of silver or $1 of gold or $1 of oil, and no matter how many hot air dollars we issue, we maintain value parity. Here, specifically, is what the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney proposed at Jackson Hole: adoption of a synthetic hegemonic currency, which would be a virtual currency, that is, nothing but digits on a computer screen, a virtual currency in a virtual reality, to replace the US dollar, and of course, this completely baseless currency is to be issued without constraint by the central bankers. That is, they want to issue as many digits as they like, pegged against your labor and your resources, with no cost to them, no risk to them, and no limit to the credit they propose to extend to themselves and whoever their cronies may be. I have a better idea, but first back to British naval history and adventures in shipping high in transit. The first mate and the ship's carpenter came up with a plan to enclose 2 side compartments on either side of the main cargo bay and completely seal them with pitch and caulking, and, taking a lesson from hot balloonists, fill these compartments with hot air so as to lift the ship up on both ends and suspend the reeking cargo in between these elevation chambers long enough to get the cargo ashore. Sort of similar to the synthetic hegemonic currency, don't you think? The use of such air bladders to perform a variety of repairs at sea was, at the time, the very latest in naval technology back then, just like cyber currencies are the latest financial technology now. The bankers are taking up a practice they learned during the New Deal, and which is clearly stated in the 1934 Emergency Banking Act. The perpetrators just arbitrarily declared that their paper dollar would be equivalent to an American silver dollar at a 1-to-1 fixed exchange rate. This allowed them to exchange paper for silver for the cost of printing, and do this on an endless basis, at least, until the American silver ran out. Now they propose to exchange mere digits in a computer ledger for a hegemony of actual, factual commodities, including silver, gold, water, wheat, rice and what have you. They are saving themselves even the printing costs of their scam and broadening the scope of commodities they can steal to promote it. This is how the US ran up a $23 trillion national debt. A very real, very factual debt owed mainly to the Americans and plus another $4 trillion secondarily owed to the Chinese. Unfortunately, the rest of us are not asleep and not trusting the bankers this time around, so the idea that we should allow them to run up an infinite debt against us and keep all the profit for themselves causes a rising gorge reaction and a natural desire to hang them as pirates without the necessity of a trial. Just the fact that Mr. Carney would dare to voice such a prospect is indicative of his utter arrogance and disrespect for both the common sense of the issue and the people he is proposing to rob. We do have laws on the books that allow us to hang pirates. Back to the Dutch port and the shit problem, the British sailors risked life and limb to carry out the plan and pump hot air into the elevation chambers, but the additional buoyancy was not sufficient and the effort to offload the cargo to Dutch farmers was not proceeding fast enough. The Dutch farmers had heard about the problems on board the ship and were familiar with what happens when you have wet manure in an enclosed space. Despite drastically reduced prices, they were not eager to come close enough to collect the manure off the ship. So, there the British seamen sat, waiting to sink or blow up. Then as now. The frantic Dutch harbourmaster implored his government to do something to get the British dung scow away from his pier and towed out of the harbour to no avail. What are the British doing exporting manure anyway? Certainly they need it for their own fields. Some members of parliament, disturbed by the odour of a neighbouring pig farm too close to the noble nostrils, came up with the scheme. Ah, well, history repeats itself. And now you know why the EU is so mad at Britain. The Brits caused the problem, hauled their manure over to the continent, and now propose to depart via a different route home, leaving the problem docked in Brussels and Berlin and as much as possible, Rome. The fact is that they have created a completely insurmountable odious debt and they all know it, but nobody is willing to take the paper loss. They would rather offload their problem onto the backs of the working people and the productive sectors of the economies of the affected countries, which is basically all of the Western world. This is also why they all have such a problem with Donald Trump. He has other options and a belief borne out by actual prior experience that energizing the manufacturing and productive capacities of our country will expand the economy. If need be, the issuance of an executive national currency like Lincoln's greenbacks or Kennedy's intended Kennedy dollars could be used to raise money for broad-spectrum reinvestment in fundamentals that would put people back to work, maybe even kickstart a general employment program to hire people off the unemployment and welfare rolls to do work similar to the Depression-era Work Projects Administration. Even more destructive from the standpoint of people like Mark Carney, Trump might even fire the Federal Reserve and establish a new national central bank. Wouldn't that be a kicker in the knickers? Such a practical solution would be nothing at all like the rose-colored limitless credit for the banks to pass out with no risk to themselves, as envisioned by Mr. Carney, with all their gambling and speculation underwritten and insured by the public, too, since the repeal of Glass-Steagall and the merger of so-called investment bank activities with standard commercial bank functions. Yes, Mr. Carney and the Bank of England are envisioning banker paradise. I trust that we are all ready and willing to send them to heaven or elsewhere, using other means. It's time for these banks to be taken over and nationalized. All of them. Beginning with the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. It's also high time to reinstate Glass-Steagall in the US and similar protective provisions in other countries, too. This makes it clear to the bankers that their self-protective sopping up of credit intended to go back into the general economy isn't a viable long-term strategy. It also tells them that their risky ventures and favorite boondoggles will have to be underwritten by other means. It's a hot day. The captain and first mate and ship's cook and ship's carpenter have disappeared in the night. Some lost-looking British sailors have begged places to stay with generous prostitutes, until they can find another ship. The reeking, slowly sinking old British ship rides against the pier. The harbour-master despairs. Ironically, the elevation chambers are keeping the old wreck barely afloat, which increases the chances of a catastrophic explosion. There's no way to tow the wreck out to sea. The only possible, and relatively fortunate outcome, would be if the ship just sank, straight down, beside the pier. After a few years the cargo would naturally degrade and except for the loss of pier space in the harbour and occasional noxious bubbles of methane breaking the surface, all could be endurable. In time, the harbour master muses, there could be a dredging operation using cranes and pulley systems and winches to remove the wreckage. Things could get back to normal with nobody getting killed and no great physical damage to the harbour. Acting upon this inspiration, the harbourmaster pays exorbitant sums to men willing to go below the water line on the old ship, and, with bits and braces, bore holes through the rotten planking on the hull, hoping to speed the ingress of seawater and sink the ship and its cargo beside the pier. He sets up pumps to pump seawater into the ship toward the same end. He even risks his own life to go aboard and open up the elevation chambers. All to no avail. The old British ship stays stubbornly afloat, if only on a crust of barnacles. It is sinking slowly, but the amount of methane is increasing every hour. The G7 can and will do nothing, because they are in debt to these looters called bankers. The only people who can help them out of the jam they are in, are the same people they have plundered, pillaged, and defrauded for 150 years. You see the problem? Finally, one hot evening in August, the harbormaster clears the harbor. He hires an expert archer with a crossbow to shoot a flaming arrow into the wreck. The resulting explosion is heard in Paris. The Dutch pier is badly damaged. The British government refuses to pay for it. The Dutch government passes laws against British manure imports. How soon we forget. Now, this is a somewhat funny story, but the situation is desperate. We absolutely cannot let the bankers get away with what they are proposing. And the U.S. Congress, which is insurmountably in debt to these same bankers, cannot be allowed to act for us in this matter. It is imperative that Americans wake up, assemble their states, and do their own mop-up. Run, don't walk. Go to www.theamericanstatesassembly.net and learn more. It is also imperative that President Trump be supported in his efforts and that he supports us. Come what may, he has stayed the course and continues to make progress against the swamp. The New York Federal Reserve CEO has threatened Trump with having to take the risk of an economic and financial meltdown right around election time, ironically, a risk that the Federal Reserve and IMF have created, if he continues to spar and bargain with China. This is because China has nailed the Fed for its debts to China. The Federal Reserve wants us to be stripped naked to pay its debts to China. And God forbid when the Americans wake up, because the Fed owes us roughly 5 times what it owes to China. Do you notice all the British corporations upping anchor and beating for home? BP just sold off all its interests in Alaska. Care to take a guess why? Because the Brits are afraid that we will find our compass and cojones and nationalize everything they claim to own. But heck, we can do that anyway, no matter where they roam or what name they adopt. The world has become a smaller place. It's no longer possible for them to just disappear over the horizon and escape the consequences of their actions. An end to the British manure trade is infinitely preferable to the solution proposed by Mr. Carney. Does anyone have a match? And some rope?